Tonight, we uncover something that might shake everything you thought you knew about Hanukkah. What if I told you that the most cherished miracle of the Festival of Lights, the oil that burned for 8 impossible days, never actually happened? What if the very books written during those events, by people who were there, mention absolutely nothing about miraculous oil? The truth hiding in ancient temples and forgotten scrolls will surprise you. So settle in, because this revelation runs deeper than you could ever imagine. Get comfortable now, pull those blankets close, and let your body sink into the mattress. Tonight's journey through ancient Jerusalem will be gentle, perfect for drifting into peaceful sleep. If you love these historical bedtime stories, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. It helps us share more fascinating tales with sleepy minds like yours. Now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let's walk together through the shadowy corridors of time, where truth and legend intertwine in the most unexpected ways. Chapter 1: Flickering Beginnings. We begin in the twilight-drenched temple of ancient Jerusalem, where stone walls echo with whispers of forgotten history. The year is around 164 BCE, and the Maccabees have just achieved something extraordinary. After years of brutal warfare against the Seleucid Empire, they've reclaimed their most sacred space. Picture these corridors now, flickering lamplight, casting long shadows across weathered stones, where victory feels both triumphant and fragile, hanging in the cool evening air like incense. The Maccabees move through these hallowed chambers with reverent determination, their footsteps soft against ancient floors. Judah Maccabee, whose very name means hammer, surveys the reclaimed temple with eyes that have seen too much bloodshed. His brothers, Jonathan and Simon, examine oil vessels left empty by years of occupation. The courage that brought them here wasn't just military, it was spiritual, a deep longing to restore what had been desecrated. Every shadow holds the memory of their struggle, every whisper carries their hope. In these quiet moments after victory, the human spirit shines brightest. The Maccabees weren't just warriors, they were keepers of tradition, protectors of identity. As they walk through the temple, checking each vessel, each sacred instrument, we see something beautiful. Their dedication goes beyond conquest, beyond political gain. This is about preserving something precious, something that connects generations. The temple walls seem to breathe with relief, as if the building itself welcomes their gentle hands, their careful restoration, their love. But here's where our story takes an intriguing turn. In the books of Maccabees, written by people who lived through these very events, who walked these same corridors, who witnessed the rededication ceremony, there's something remarkably absent. These detailed accounts, filled with military strategies, political maneuvering, temple restoration, mention 8 days of celebration, but they speak only of building a new altar, of joy, of thanksgiving. No mention of oil burning beyond its natural limit, no miraculous flame dancing impossibly long. Imagine the scribes who recorded these events, their reed pens scratching across papyrus in the soft glow of oil lamps. They documented everything, every battle, every prayer, every moment of significance. Yet when describing the 8-day celebration, they focus on the rededication ceremony, the building of a new altar, the joy of reclaiming their sacred space. If oil had burned miraculously for 8 days, wouldn't such an extraordinary divine intervention have demanded their attention? Wouldn't they have proclaimed this wonder, this clear sign of heavenly favor? The silence grows more curious when we consider other ancient voices. Josephus, the great Jewish historian, wrote extensively about the Maccabees centuries later. His detailed accounts include the temple's rededication, the celebration, the establishment of the festival. Yet he too remains mysteriously quiet about miraculous oil. Other historians, rabbis, scholars of antiquity, all describe Hanukkah's origins, but their focus remains on military victory, on temple purification, on the triumph of religious freedom. The oil miracle, so central to modern celebrations, simply isn't there. Walk deeper into the temple now, through these stone archways where empty oil vessels wait in shadowy alcoves. Each vessel tells a story, but not the story we might expect. The Maccabees found the temple defiled, its sacred implements scattered or destroyed. The work of restoration was monumental, requiring new consecrated oil, new vessels, new dedication. The 8 days they celebrated weren't about waiting for oil to miraculously burn, but about the careful, loving process of making their temple holy again, of rebuilding what had been broken. The atmosphere in these ancient halls shifts as we consider this absence, this curious gap in the historical record. It's not that the oil miracle is explicitly denied, it simply isn't mentioned. Ancient scrolls rustle with other concerns, other celebrations, other meanings for the 8 day festival. Some scholars suggest those 8 days echoed Sukkot, the harvest festival the Maccabees had missed during their military campaigns. Others point to the time needed to properly consecrate a new altar, a process requiring careful ritual, patient dedication, divine timing that had nothing to do with miraculous oil. Picture the Maccabees in these quiet moments, not waiting anxiously for oil to last, but working diligently to restore every detail of temple worship. Judah examines ancient texts, seeking proper procedures, correct rituals. His brothers organize the rededication ceremony, planning 8 days of celebration that would establish this victory permanently in Jewish memory. The focus isn't on scarcity, on hoping for miracles, but on abundance, on thanksgiving, on the human dedication that made divine worship possible again. Their joy comes from accomplishment, from homecoming, from restoration completed. The temple corridors echo with something profound, the sound of human courage transforming into lasting tradition. These men didn't just fight a war, they rebuilt a way of life. Every cleaned vessel, every repaired altar stone, every carefully lit lamp represents their commitment to something greater than themselves. The 8 days they celebrated marked not just military victory, but spiritual homecoming. They weren't waiting for God to work miracles. They were working alongside the divine partners in restoration, co-creators of sacred space, human hands doing holy work. As we move through these hallowed spaces, notice how the earliest understanding of Hanukkah was beautifully human. It celebrated courage, dedication, the willingness to fight for what matters most. The Maccabees didn't need supernatural oil to make their victory meaningful. Their own dedication was miracle enough. The 8 days commemorated their commitment to rebuilding, to restoration, to the patient work of making sacred space sacred again. This wasn't about divine intervention overriding natural law, but about human hearts aligning with divine purpose, creating something beautiful together. But here, in these quiet temple chambers, we glimpse something that would trouble later generations. The original Hanukkah story was intensely political, unavoidably bloody, disturbingly human. It celebrated military victory, successful rebellion, the violent overthrow of oppression. While this victory preserved religious freedom, it did so through warfare, through tactics that made some people uncomfortable. The Maccabees were heroes, but they were also warriors. Their story was inspiring, but also complex, messy, real, perhaps too real for some tastes, too human for comfort. The temple walls hold this tension, this uncomfortable truth about heroism. The Maccabees saved their people, preserved their traditions, restored their sacred space, but they did it through methods that later generations would find problematic. Successful rebellion required violence, political maneuvering, military strategy. The 8-day celebration honored this victory, but it was a celebration of war, of human triumph over human oppression. There's beauty in their courage, but also complexity in their methods. The original story was more human, more political, more troubling than later generations preferred. And so we leave these twilight-lit corridors with a question lingering in the air. If the oil miracle isn't in the original accounts, if it took centuries to appear, if the earliest celebrations focused purely on military victory and temple restoration, then where did the story come from? Why did it develop? What need did it serve? The temple stones keep their secrets. The empty oil vessels remain mysteriously silent. And somewhere in that silence, we begin to understand that the story of Hanukkah, like history itself, is far more complex than we ever imagined. Chapter 2 of Victory and Silence. As we drift deeper into this ancient mystery, we encounter a man whose words shaped how we understand Jewish history. Flavius Josephus, historian extraordinaire, witness to the destruction of the Second Temple, chronicler of rebellions and triumphs, his quill scratched across parchment by lamplight, recording every detail of Jewish life and struggle. Yet in all his meticulous accounts, something profound is missing, something that should have been there, but simply is not. Picture Josephus in his study, surrounded by scrolls and memories of a world that once was. He writes of the Maccabees with reverence, their courage against impossible odds, their reclamation of the sacred temple. He describes the rededication ceremonies, the joy of a people reclaiming their holy space, the restoration of proper worship. His words flow like honey, capturing every nuance of triumph. But listen carefully to what he does not say, to the silence between his sentences. In his masterwork Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus devotes careful attention to the Maccabean revolt. He speaks of Judas Maccabeus, the warrior priest who led his people to freedom. He details the cleansing of the defiled temple, the removal of pagan altars, the restoration of Jewish ritual, every stone replaced, every vessel purified, every corner blessed anew. His account breathes with the satisfaction of victory, of wrongs made right, of a people returning home. But as you settle deeper into sleep, notice what Josephus does not mention. No miraculous oil, no divine intervention, no flames that burned beyond possibility. His silence echoes through the centuries, a void where we might expect wonder. This man who recorded every miracle, every divine sign, every moment when heaven touched earth, remains curiously quiet about what we now consider Hanukkah's greatest miracle. The absence itself tells a story, whispered in the spaces between words. Imagine the weight of this silence settling like dust over ancient manuscripts. Josephus lived close to these events, closer than we can fathom. He interviewed survivors, collected testimonies, sifted through eyewitness accounts. If oil had burned for 8 miraculous days, if divine light had sustained the temple, surely this devoted historian would have recorded such wonder. His pen would have danced with joy, capturing every detail of heaven's intervention. Yet his pages remain silent, beautifully, mysteriously silent. The lamplight flickers as we consider other ancient voices, equally quiet on this matter. Philo of Alexandria, prolific writer, master of Jewish philosophy, contemporary of Josephus. He too describes Jewish festivals and miracles, yet offers no mention of miraculous oil. The first book of Maccabees, written by someone who lived through these very events, celebrates the victory, honors the rededication, but speaks no word of supernatural flames that refuse to die. Let your breathing slow as you ponder the second book of Maccabees, another contemporary account filled with supernatural wonders. Fire from heaven, divine warriors appearing in battle, miraculous interventions at every turn. This author loved recording the divine, the impossible, the moments when God's hand moved visibly through history. Yet even here, in a book that celebrates divine miracles, the oil that burned for 8 days finds no mention, no recognition, no place in the story. Close your eyes and drift with this question. Why would multiple historians, all passionate about Jewish identity, all devoted to recording divine providence, remain silent about such a beautiful miracle? Their pages overflow with other wonders, seas parting, walls falling, supernatural rescues. They were not skeptics of the divine, but believers who saw God's hand everywhere. Yet this particular miracle, this oil that defied nature, finds no welcome in their careful chronicles. The silence grows deeper when we realize how perfect this miracle would have been for their purposes. Jewish historians writing for Jewish audiences, trying to preserve faith in difficult times, needing stories of divine care and intervention. An 8-day miracle, light conquering darkness, God providing for his people's needs. What better story could they ask for? Yet they chose to omit it, to focus instead on human courage, on political victory, on the very earthly triumph of determined warriors. Feel yourself sinking deeper into contemplation, surrounded by the warm glow of understanding. These ancient writers knew something we are only now discovering, that victory itself was miracle enough. The successful revolt against impossible odds, the reclamation of sacred space, the restoration of proper worship, these were the miracles that mattered. Human courage, guided by divine purpose, ordinary people achieving extraordinary things, faith expressed through action rather than supernatural intervention. The manuscripts rustle softly as we turn to another curious detail, the prayers themselves. Ancient Jewish liturgy for Hanukkah, words that have survived centuries, blessings that capture the essence of the celebration. These prayers speak of military victory, of deliverance from oppression, of the few defeating the many. They thank God for enabling triumph, for restoring the temple, for returning proper worship to the people. But they do not mention oil, do not celebrate miraculous light, do not reference the 8-day wonder. Let this puzzle settle gently in your mind, like snow falling on winter ground. If the oil miracle was central to Hanukkah's meaning, if it was the reason for 8 days of celebration, surely the prayers would reflect this. The liturgy would overflow with gratitude for divine light, for oil that lasted beyond nature's limits, for God's provision in desperate times. Instead, the prayers focus on liberation, on courage, on the restoration of religious freedom, on very human victories. Your eyelids grow heavy as you consider the implications drifting through centuries of carefully preserved silence. This is not accidental omission, not careless oversight, but deliberate focus on what truly mattered to those who lived through these events. They celebrated freedom, they honored courage, they remembered the moment when faith translated into action. The miracle they witnessed was not supernatural oil, but ordinary people becoming extraordinary, the divine working through human hands, through human hearts. Feel the soft weight of historical truth settling over you like a comfortable blanket. The silence speaks as loudly as any words, revealing priorities, showing us what those closest to the events considered most important. They were not interested in supernatural spectacle, but in the deeper miracle of transformation, the way despair became hope, defeat became victory, oppression became freedom. The true miracle was not in burning oil, but in burning hearts, in faith that refused to be extinguished. As you drift toward sleep, let yourself rest in this ancient wisdom, this understanding that some silences are more eloquent than speech. The historians who lived closest to these events, who interviewed the survivors, who felt the triumph still fresh in their memories, they knew what miracle truly mattered. It was not about oil lasting beyond its time, but about hope lasting beyond despair, about the human spirit burning bright when everything else seemed dark. The lamplight dims as we prepare to leave this chapter behind, having learned to read the spaces between words, to hear the stories that silence tells. Tomorrow we will discover how this beautiful absence, this eloquent omission, eventually became filled with new meaning, new purpose, new miracles. But for now, let yourself rest in the peaceful knowledge that sometimes the most profound truths are found not in what is said, but in what is lovingly, purposefully left unsaid. Chapter 3: Centuries in Shadows. Now we enter the most mysterious part of our journey, the long, silent years that stretch like an endless corridor between the Maccabean victory and the first whisper of oil miracles. Picture ancient libraries where dust motes dance in amber lamplight, scrolls and codices lined on wooden shelves, each one a witness to what was remembered, and more importantly, what was forgotten. These centuries hold secrets in their silence, secrets that change everything we thought we knew about this beloved story. Imagine walking through the halls of history, your footsteps echoing softly on stone floors, worn smooth by countless scholars before you. Here in these sacred spaces of learning, we begin to understand what the absence of a story can tell us. For 600 years, generation after generation of writers, historians, and holy men put quill to parchment, yet not one, not a single soul, mentioned oil that burned for 8 miraculous days. The silence speaks volumes if we know how to listen. Let's settle into the warm glow of candlelight and examine the timeline that stretches before us like an ancient map. Here, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Maccabees triumph. The temple is cleansed and rededicated. Celebrations begin, but as we trace our finger along the centuries that follow, through the works of Josephus, through early rabbinical writings, through countless historical accounts, we find something remarkable: complete and utter silence about any oil miracle. The absence itself becomes our most important clue. Picture yourself as an archaeological detective, carefully brushing away layers of time and assumption. What we discover in these early centuries is fascinating. Hanukkah was celebrated, yes, but for entirely different reasons. The focus was crystal clear: military victory, the cleansing of the temple, the triumph of religious freedom over oppression. In these earliest accounts, oil plays no special role, no divine intervention, no miraculous multiplication, just human courage, determination, and the sweet taste of hard-won victory against impossible odds. Now imagine yourself in a monastery scriptorium, where monks carefully copy ancient texts by flickering candlelight. Their quills scratch softly across parchment as they preserve the words of Josephus, that great Jewish historian who lived just decades after the temple's destruction. Surely, if anyone would know about an oil miracle, it would be him. He writes extensively about Hanukkah, calling it the Festival of Lights, but when we read his words carefully, we find no mention of miraculous oil, no divine intervention, just lights commemorating victory. As you sink deeper into these historical mysteries, notice how the early sources paint a remarkably consistent picture. The books of Maccabees, written by those who lived through the actual events, describe the 8 day celebration in detail. They tell us exactly why 8 days were chosen to mirror the Sukkot festival they had missed while fighting in the wilderness. But oil miracles, divine multiplication, supernatural interventions, these elements are conspicuously absent from every single contemporary account. The silence grows more intriguing with each passing century. Let your mind drift now to the great libraries of Alexandria, where scholars gathered around low tables covered with scrolls, their discussions flowing like gentle streams of wisdom. These learned men preserved every detail they deemed important, every miracle, every divine sign, every supernatural occurrence that touched their people's history. Yet in all their meticulous record keeping, in all their careful documentation, the oil miracle remains invisible, a ghost that hasn't yet learned to haunt the halls of history. Picture timelines stretching across parchment like rivers of time, each marked with significant events, battles won, temples built, miracles recorded. But in the centuries following the Maccabean revolt, where we might expect to find the oil story flowering, we find instead a curious void, a space where silence reigns supreme. This isn't mere oversight, it's a pattern. The absence of evidence becomes evidence itself, whispering to us across the centuries about stories yet to be born, tales that would emerge much. Imagine yourself now in the gentle warmth of a candle-lit study, surrounded by the musty scent of ancient parchments. Here we discover something remarkable, the rabbinical literature of the first few centuries after the temple's destruction, the Mishnah, the earliest layers of the Talmud. They discuss Hanukkah extensively, debating its customs, its meanings, its proper observance. Yet even in these detailed discussions, the oil miracle remains notably absent, like a missing piece in an otherwise complete puzzle. The pattern of silence continues to weave itself through time. As you rest in this quiet contemplation, consider what this silence tells us about the nature of historical memory. Stories don't simply vanish from collective consciousness if they were there from the beginning. Important miracles, especially ones involving divine intervention, tend to be remembered, retold, celebrated, passed down like precious heirlooms from generation to generation. The fact that the oil story appears nowhere in these early centuries suggests something profound. It wasn't there yet, waiting to be born in the minds of later storytellers. Now let your thoughts drift to the great scriptoriums where centuries of wisdom were preserved. Imagine the soft scratch of reed pens on papyrus, the gentle whisper of turning pages, the quiet dedication of scholars, preserving every detail they considered sacred. In these hushed chambers of learning, we find discussions of Hanukkah's military victory, its message of religious freedom, its celebration of the temple's purification. But the miraculous oil, that beloved story we know so well, remains conspicuously absent from every single manuscript, every careful record, every devotional text. Picture yourself walking through a library where time itself seems suspended, where ancient wisdom rests peacefully on wooden shelves, waiting to share its secrets. Here we encounter the writings of the Church Fathers, early Christian scholars who were fascinated by Jewish traditions, who recorded every detail that struck them as significant or miraculous. Yet even these careful observers, these collectors of wonder stories, make no mention of Hanukkah oil miracles. Their silence adds another layer to our growing understanding, another piece of evidence in this puzzle of absence. And as you settle deeper into this historical mystery, imagine the moment when everything changed. Somewhere around the 6th century of the Common Era, in the warm glow of Babylonian academies, where rabbis gathered to debate and discuss sacred matters. Here, finally, after 600 years of silence, the oil story makes its first appearance, not in a historical account, not in a contemporary chronicle, but buried deep within the complex discussions of the Babylonian Talmud, like a seed that had been waiting centuries to sprout. Picture the scene in those Babylonian study halls, oil lamps casting dancing shadows on walls lined with scrolls, voices raised in gentle debate about matters both practical and profound. It's here, in Tractate Shabbat, that we finally encounter the oil miracle, almost casually mentioned, as if explaining why Hanukkah lasts 8 days. But this late appearance, this sudden emergence after centuries of silence, raises more questions than it answers. Why now, after all these years, does this story finally see the light of day? Imagine holding that ancient Talmudic text in your hands, feeling the weight of centuries, the soft texture of aged parchment beneath your fingertips. This is where our beloved oil story first breathes, where it takes its first tentative steps into the light of recorded history. But its late birth raises profound questions, questions that ripple through our understanding like stones dropped in still water. What happened during those silent centuries? What changed in the minds and hearts of the rabbis? What need arose that this story was born to fill? As we close this chapter of silence and emergence, let yourself rest in the quiet wonder of historical discovery. We've walked through 600 years of absence, through libraries and scriptoriums, through the careful records of historians and scholars, only to find our cherished oil miracle conspicuously absent. Then, suddenly, dramatically, it appears in the Babylonian Talmud, like a star suddenly blazing in a previously empty patch of sky. This pattern of silence, followed by sudden appearance, this archaeological truth, changes everything we thought we knew about this beloved story. Chapter 4, Miracle in Ink. Now we venture deeper into the labyrinthine passages of the Babylonian Talmud itself, where ancient parchment holds secrets that scholars have debated for generations. Here, in these yellowed manuscripts, we find the very first mention of oil that burned for 8 miraculous days. But as we trace the ink across these pages, a fascinating question emerges. Why did it take 600 years for this miracle to appear in writing when the events themselves were so carefully documented by those who lived them? Modern scholars have proposed something remarkable, that the rabbis who penned these Talmudic passages may have intentionally crafted this miracle story, not out of deception, but out of profound necessity. They lived in a world vastly different from the Maccabees, a world where Jewish identity needed reshaping. The original Hanukkah story was one of warfare, of brother fighting brother, of political rebellion and bloodshed. Perhaps these wise rabbis saw something troubling in celebrating violence, even righteous violence. Picture the world these Talmudic rabbis inhabited, centuries after the temple's destruction, living under Roman occupation, watching their people scattered across distant lands. The old stories of military triumph felt hollow, even dangerous. What good were tales of successful rebellion when rebellion now meant certain death? What comfort could warriors provide when the temple lay in ruins, when sacrifice and ritual had become impossible? These rabbis needed something different, something that spoke to survival rather than conquest. The brilliance of their solution becomes clear when we consider their circumstances. They took a story about human victory, about swords and strategy, about the Maccabees' military genius, and transformed it into something divine. No longer were Jews celebrating their ancestors' ability to kill their enemies. Instead, they were marveling at God's ability to make a single day's oil burn for 8. The shift was subtle but revolutionary. From bloodshed to blessing, from warfare to wonder, from human strength to divine intervention. This transformation served multiple purposes for these ancient editors. First, it made Hanukkah safe to celebrate under Roman rule. A story about miraculous oil posed no threat to imperial authority, while tales of successful Jewish rebellion certainly would have. Second, it emphasized God's continuing presence with the Jewish people, even in exile, even after the temple's destruction. The message was clear: divine power hadn't abandoned them. It had simply taken a different form, working through everyday miracles rather than military victories. The rabbis lived in constant tension, balancing preservation of tradition with adaptation to new realities. They watched their people struggle with identity questions that the Maccabees never faced. How do you remain Jewish without a temple? How do you celebrate victory when you're conquered? How do you tell stories of God's favor when suffering seems endless? The oil miracle provided elegant answers. It suggested that God's presence wasn't limited to grand temples or mighty armies, but could be found in simple acts of faith. Consider the psychological burden these rabbis carried. They were the guardians of Jewish memory, responsible for passing down stories that would shape their people's identity for generations. The original Hanukkah narrative, while historically accurate, emphasized human agency over divine providence. The Maccabees succeeded through courage, cunning, and military skill. But what did that teach Jews living under Roman occupation? That they should rebel and die. The rabbis needed a different lesson, one that emphasized faith over force, patience over power. The society these Talmudic scholars inhabited was one of constant spiritual crisis. The temple's destruction had shattered traditional Judaism, leaving communities to reinvent their relationship with the divine. Old rituals were impossible. Ancient hierarchies had crumbled. The very foundations of Jewish religious life needed reconstruction. In this context, creating new sacred stories wasn't deception, it was survival. The oil miracle gave Jews something to hold on to, a narrative that made sense of their exile while preserving hope for eventual restoration. These rabbis understood something profound about storytelling, that different times require different truths. The Maccabees era needed stories of resistance, of fighting back against oppression, of human courage in the face of overwhelming odds. But the Talmudic period required different narratives, ones that emphasized endurance over rebellion, faith over force, divine intervention over human action. The oil miracle perfectly served this need, transforming a story of war into a tale of wonder, making Hanukkah about God rather than generals. The genius of this transformation lies in its subtlety. The rabbis didn't discard the original story, they supplemented it. Military victory remained part of Hanukkah, but miraculous oil became its centerpiece. This allowed them to honor their ancestors while reshaping their descendants' understanding. The Maccabees were still heroes, but God became the ultimate hero. Human courage mattered, but divine providence mattered more. It was a masterful rebalancing, preserving history while creating new meaning, maintaining tradition while adapting to changed circumstances. The pressure these rabbis felt wasn't just political, it was existential. They watched Jewish communities across the diaspora struggling to maintain identity without the unifying presence of the temple. Different regions were developing different practices, different interpretations, different relationships with their shared heritage. The oil miracle provided something universal, a story that worked equally well in Babylon and Rome, in Alexandria and Jerusalem. It gave scattered Jews a common wonder to contemplate, a shared miracle to celebrate, a unified narrative to pass to their children. These ancient editors faced a delicate balancing act. They needed to preserve enough historical accuracy to maintain credibility, while introducing enough divine intervention to serve their community's spiritual needs. The oil miracle achieved this balance perfectly. It didn't contradict any existing historical records. It simply added a layer of meaning that previous accounts had overlooked. Who could prove that oil hadn't burned miraculously? Who could deny that God might work in ways that historians missed? The story was unfalsifiable and therefore perfect for its purpose. The world these rabbis knew was one where Jewish survival depended increasingly on adaptation rather than resistance, on wisdom rather than warfare, on finding God in exile rather than expecting miraculous return to sovereignty. The oil story provided a template for this kind of spirituality. It showed that divine presence could manifest in small ways, in everyday circumstances, in the extension of ordinary things beyond their natural limits. This was exactly the kind of faith their communities needed: portable, personal, and independent of political circumstances. As we trace these ancient ink marks across yellowed parchment, we can almost feel the weight of responsibility these rabbis carried. They knew they were shaping how future generations would understand their heritage, how children would learn about God, how communities would celebrate survival and resilience. The oil miracle wasn't just a story, it was a gift to the future, a narrative that would give meaning to Jewish suffering, hope to Jewish endurance, and wonder to Jewish celebration for centuries to come. The more we study these Talmudic passages, the more we appreciate their creators' psychological insight. They understood that humans need stories that match their circumstances, narratives that speak to their actual conditions rather than their ancestors' experiences. The oil miracle provided this relevance, offering a model of divine care that worked for people who couldn't fight, couldn't rebel, couldn't win through force. Instead, they could light candles, tell stories, and trust in quiet miracles that sustain rather than conquer. And so we're left with a gentle question that echoes through these ancient halls of learning. Who really created this miracle, and what were their deepest intentions? Was it divine intervention, preserving oil against natural law, or was it human wisdom preserving hope against despair? Perhaps, in the end, both answers carry their own truth, their own beauty, their own necessary place in the continuing story of faith, adaptation, and the countless ways we find meaning in the darkness. Chapter 5, 8 Days of Echoes. Tonight we drift deeper into the shadows of ancient history, where the original 8 days of Hanukkah whisper their long-forgotten secrets. These weren't days of miraculous oil burning endlessly, but something far more human, far more tangibly real. Listen closely as we uncover how these 8 sacred days actually commemorated the altar's painstaking construction, or perhaps lovingly mirrored the missed Sukkot festival they had lost. The truth echoes through countless centuries, patiently waiting to be heard. Picture the temple in 164 BCE, not filled with divine light, but with the sound of hammers and chisels. The Maccabees had won their bloody victory, but now came the harder task, rebuilding what had been desecrated. Stone by stone, they constructed a new altar, 8 days of sacred labor, 8 days of dedication ceremonies, 8 days that would echo through history in ways they never imagined. The craftsmen worked by lamplight, their tools singing against marble and bronze in the cool Jerusalem air. But there's another theory, one that connects these 8 days to something even more poignant. The festival of Sukkot, 7 days of autumn celebration they had missed while hiding in caves and fighting for their lives. Add the sacred 8th day of Shemini Atzeret, and you have 8 days of joy they desperately needed to reclaim. 8 days of harvest, thanksgiving, 8 days of dwelling in temporary shelters, now celebrated in the permanent shelter of their reclaimed temple. The book of 2nd Maccabees hints at this connection, describing how they celebrated for 8 days like the Feast of Tabernacles. They carried branches and palm fronds, they sang hymns of gratitude, they offered sacrifices with hearts full of relief. This wasn't about oil lasting impossibly long. This was about a people finally able to celebrate the festivals they had been denied. 8 days to make up for all the holy time they had lost during years of persecution and war. Listen to the quiet sounds that would have filled those temple courts, the soft crackling of ember in bronze braziers, the gentle rustling of ceremonial cloth as priests moved through their sacred duties. These were the true echoes of those first 8 days, not supernatural flames that defied physics, but the very human sounds of restoration, whispered prayers of thanksgiving, footsteps on ancient stone, the clink of new vessels replacing those that had been melted down or stolen. The altar itself tells a story of defiance and hope, every stone carefully selected, every measurement precise according to ancient law, every detail a rejection of the Greek altar that had polluted this sacred space. For 8 days they built, for 8 days they consecrated, for 8 days they reclaimed, not just a building, but their identity as a people. The echo of hammers became the echo of hearts, beating with renewed purpose and unshakable faith in their traditions. Consider how memory works, how stories change as they pass from mouth to mouth, generation to generation. These 8 days of altar dedication, these 8 days of celebrating missed festivals, they created a rhythm that felt sacred in itself. 8 became the number of renewal. 8 became the number of light, returning to darkness. 8 became the number that connected past traditions with present hope. The echoes grew louder as time passed, taking on new meanings. The archaeological evidence supports this quieter version of events. Fragments of dedication inscriptions, pieces of ceremonial vessels, construction materials that tell of careful, deliberate rebuilding. No miraculous lamps, no impossible oil supplies, and just the patient work of restoration. 8 days to properly consecrate what they had built. 8 days to ensure every ritual was performed correctly. 8 days to guarantee their temple would never again be vulnerable to foreign contamination and desecration. But here's where the story becomes psychologically fascinating. Humans have always struggled with victories that feel too earthly, too achievable through mere human effort. The Maccabees had won through strategy, courage, and sheer determination. But was that enough? Was that worthy of eternal celebration? Somewhere in the collective unconscious, the need for divine intervention began to whisper. The 8 days needed to become something more, something that elevated human triumph into heavenly miracle. This psychological need explains so much about how stories evolve, how legends grow from seeds of historical fact. The 8 days were genuinely sacred, genuinely meaningful, genuinely worth celebrating. But over centuries, that wasn't enough for a people who had suffered so much persecution. They needed God to have been present in that moment, needed proof that their victory came from heaven, not just from their own bloodied hands and desperate courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The connection to Sukkot makes this psychological transformation even more poignant because Sukkot was already a festival about divine protection. For 7 days plus one, they would dwell in temporary shelters, remembering how God had protected them in the wilderness. Now, in their reclaimed temple, they needed that same sense of divine presence, needed to feel that their victory over the Greeks was just another chapter in their eternal story of heavenly guardianship and miraculous deliverance. The original 8 days carried their own profound beauty, the beauty of human dedication, of careful craftsmanship, of community coming together to rebuild what had been broken. The sound of hammers on stone, the scent of fresh mortar, the sight of new bronze gleaming in lamplight, these were miracles enough for those who lived them. But later generations needed something more supernatural, something that transcended the merely human realm of victory and restoration. Think about the psychological weight of celebrating a purely military victory, year after year, century after century. How do you teach children about the beauty of warfare, the necessity of violence, the glory of killing enemies? It becomes uncomfortable, morally complex, difficult to reconcile with teachings about peace and love. But a miracle of light, a story about divine intervention, extending oil supplies that transforms everything into something pure and holy. The echoes of those original 8 days still whisper, if you listen carefully, in the rhythm of construction, in the pattern of dedication ceremonies, in the cycle of festivals that needed to be reclaimed and celebrated. These weren't supernatural echoes, they were human echoes, the sound of a people refusing to let their traditions die, refusing to let their sacred spaces remain defiled, refusing to accept that their God had abandoned them to foreign oppression and cultural extinction. As we drift toward sleep tonight, let these gentler echoes fill your consciousness, the sound of careful hands rebuilding what was broken, the whispered prayers of gratitude for simple victories, the recognition that sometimes the most profound miracles are the ones we create ourselves through determination, community, and unwavering faith in our deepest values. The 8 days echo still, not with supernatural fire, but with the eternal flame of human resilience. The truth about those 8 days is beautiful enough without embellishment. 8 days of rebuilding, 8 days of celebration, 8 days of reclaiming identity and tradition from the forces that sought to destroy them. Let that be your final thought as you settle into sleep, that the real miracle was never about oil lasting impossibly long, but about the human spirit lasting impossibly long against overwhelming odds. Rest now and let the echoes of ancient dedication ceremonies fill your dreams. Chapter 6: A Longing for Light. Here we must turn inward to explore not what happened, but why a story needed to be born. Sometimes the most revealing truths lie not in ancient scrolls or archaeological findings, but in the tender vulnerabilities of the human heart. What drove people to reach beyond the merely historical, towards something that felt more than human, more than political, more than war? Picture Jerusalem after the temple's rededication. The military victory is complete, the enemy driven out, the altar rebuilt stone by stone. Yet, in the quiet moments between celebration, questions linger like shadows. Was this triumph truly worth the bloodshed, the families torn apart, the years of hiding in caves? Victory can taste surprisingly hollow when the cheering stops, when the full cost becomes clear. The Maccabees had won through violence, through rebellion, through very human determination. But victories achieved by sword and strategy carry a weight, a darkness that follows the survivors home. Perhaps some began to wonder, where was the divine presence in all this suffering? Where was God when children hid in darkness, when families fled their homes, when hope seemed extinguished? This psychological landscape, this need to find meaning beyond mere human struggle, begins to illuminate why a miracle story might emerge later, not because it happened, but because it needed to have happened. The heart rebels against the idea that sacred victories come only through bloodshed, that God works exclusively through war, that the divine requires no gentler touch than conquest. Consider the weight carried by those who survived. Trauma has its own timeline, its own logic. Years might pass before the full emotional cost of the rebellion surfaces. The nightmares, the guilt of survival, the haunting question of whether their cause truly justified the suffering they witnessed. In such darkness, the human soul searches desperately for light, for meaning, for divine presence. Perhaps the oil story emerged from this longing, this deep psychological need to see God, not just in victory, but in gentleness. A miracle of light rather than sword, of sustenance rather than conquest, of quiet divine presence rather than the terrible silence that accompanies war. The heart craves evidence that the sacred cares for small things, ordinary things, vulnerable things, like flickering flames. Think of parents trying to explain these events to their children. How do you tell a young one about the necessity of violence, about the complexity of religious freedom bought with blood? The oil miracle offers a softer entry point, a story where God provides rather than punishes, where light multiplies rather than lives being lost, where wonder replaces the harsh realities of war. The psychological appeal becomes even clearer when we consider the nature of light itself. Light dispels darkness without violence, illuminates without destroying, offers hope without demanding sacrifice. In a world where liberation had come through such painful means, the idea of divine light, quietly sustaining itself, feels like healing, like the gentler God many hearts long to encounter, to trust, to celebrate. There's also the matter of collective memory and its curious transformations. Communities naturally shape their stories toward meaning, toward hope, toward versions that can be passed down without breaking hearts in the telling. The oil miracle doesn't compete with historical facts. It serves a different hunger, the hunger for sacred presence in the ordinary moments, for God in the gentle spaces between great events. Perhaps the rabbis who first recorded the oil story understood this intuitively. They weren't historians seeking to document, but spiritual guides seeking to heal, to offer their communities a way to find divine presence that didn't require celebrating violence. The miracle story becomes a gift, a gentle reframing that allows celebration without glorifying war, light without requiring darkness as its necessary predecessor. Consider how this reframing changes everything. Instead of lighting candles to remember military victory, families light them to celebrate divine provision. Instead of teaching children about successful rebellion, parents share stories of God caring for small needs, of light lasting longer than expected, of hope appearing precisely when supplies run short. The same 8 nights transformed into something infinitely more tender. This psychological evolution makes profound sense. Humans need their celebrations to nourish rather than trouble the spirit, to inspire rather than burden with complexity, to connect them with the sacred through joy rather than through remembering justified violence. The oil miracle serves this deep need, offering a pathway to celebration that feels clean, pure, unmarked by moral ambiguity or historical shadow. Even more significantly, the miracle story allows believers to focus on divine presence in the present moment. Rather than looking backward to assess the righteousness of past conflicts, they can look forward to trust in ongoing provision. Rather than wrestling with the ethics of religious war, they can simply kindle light and trust that somehow, miraculously, there will be enough, always enough, for today and tomorrow. This creates space for a different kind of faith, one that doesn't require understanding violence or justifying conflict, but simply trusts in gentle divine presence. The oil miracle becomes a doorway into childlike wonder, into gratitude for small provisions, into the kind of spirituality that can be shared across generations without requiring lengthy explanations about the complexities of religious freedom and political resistance. Perhaps this is why the miracle story feels so necessary, so right, even if historically questionable. It serves the heart's deepest longing for a God who cares about daily needs, who shows up in gentle ways, who multiplies small provisions rather than demanding great sacrifices. It offers a spirituality of abundance rather than scarcity, of light rather than shadow, of quiet miracles rather than dramatic interventions. And here lies perhaps the most telling evidence of all. The traditional prayers for Hanukkah, the ancient liturgical texts that have guided Jewish celebration for centuries, speak of victory and rededication, of military triumph and temple restoration, but remain curiously silent about miraculous oil. Even in worship, the miracle that supposedly defines the holiday disappears into reverent silence, as if the heart knows, somehow, which story is history and which is hope. Chapter 7: Prayers in the Dark. In the hushed chambers of synagogues worldwide, ancient words flow like rivers through time. Yet within these sacred prayers lies a curious omission, a silence that speaks volumes. Tonight, we drift deeper into this mystery, exploring why the most fundamental Jewish prayers about Hanukkah never whisper of miraculous oil. Let the gentle rhythm of ancient Hebrew carry you into peaceful contemplation as we uncover what was deliberately left unsaid in these holy words. The Al-Hanisim prayer, recited during Hanukkah in every Orthodox synagogue, tells a fascinating story. It speaks of wicked kingdoms rising against Israel, of brave Maccabees fighting back, of victory and temple purification. Every detail carefully preserved, every triumph lovingly remembered. But listen closely to what it doesn't say. No mention of oil running low, no miracle of 8 nights from one day's supply. Just silence where the most beloved miracle should be, a telling absence that whispers its own truth. These prayers were crafted by rabbis who knew their history intimately. They had access to ancient sources we can barely imagine, scrolls and testimonies lost to time. Yet when they chose which miracles to commemorate in sacred liturgy, they selected military victory and temple rededication. The oil stays silent in their careful words. Consider this: if the oil miracle had been part of the original story, would these learned scholars have omitted Judaism's most famous miracle from their most important prayers? The Hallel prayers sung during Hanukkah echo with gratitude for deliverance from enemies. Psalm after psalm celebrates God's protection of the Jewish people. You can almost hear the voices rising in ancient temples, thanking the divine for military salvation and spiritual freedom. Yet again, not a whisper about oil lasting 8 days. These Thanksgiving songs focus on human courage, blessed by divine favor, on warriors fighting and winning, on a temple restored to its former glory. The absence speaks volumes. Even the Haftarah, the prophetic reading chosen specifically for Hanukkah, comes from Zechariah. It speaks of divine spirit accomplishing what human might cannot, yet makes no reference to miraculous oil. Instead, it emphasizes that victory comes not by force, but by God's Spirit. The rabbis who selected this reading had countless biblical passages to choose from, yet they picked one that celebrates spiritual triumph without mentioning the oil miracle that supposedly defined the holiday. Another curious silence to ponder. In medieval prayer books, the blessing over Hanukkah candles speaks simply of miracles performed for our ancestors in those days. Beautifully vague, mysteriously general, it could refer to military victory, to temple rededication, to any number of divine interventions. But it doesn't specify oil lasting 8 days. Even when Jewish communities had fully embraced the oil story in their folklore and celebrations, their formal prayers remained diplomatically silent about the specific nature of the miracle, a careful ambiguity preserved through centuries. The Sephardic traditions, preserved in communities from Spain to Morocco to the Ottoman Empire, maintain prayer customs slightly different from Ashkenazi Jews. Yet both traditions share the same curious omission. Across geographic boundaries and cultural differences, across centuries of separate development, Jewish prayers about Hanukkah consistently avoid mentioning the oil miracle. This isn't coincidence. It suggests a shared ancient tradition of liturgical caution, a collective memory that the oil story came later, after the prayers were already established and sanctified. Imagine the rabbis centuries ago carefully crafting words that would be repeated for generations. They understood the power of liturgy to shape belief, to create lasting memory. Every word chosen with intention, every phrase polished to perfection. If the oil miracle had been part of their inherited tradition, part of the story they received from earlier generations, would they have crafted prayers that dance around it? The very care they took in composition suggests they knew something we're only now discovering. The morning prayers during Hanukkah include special editions, moments where the oil miracle could naturally fit. Yet these insertions focus on military deliverance and temple purification. The liturgical poets had perfect opportunities to weave in miraculous oil to make it central to the prayer experience. Instead, they consistently chose themes of human courage, blessed by divine favor. These weren't oversights by careless scribes, but deliberate choices by learned scholars who understood the difference between folklore and verified tradition. Even the Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after meals, includes special Hanukkah prayers. Here, in the intimate setting of family gatherings, where stories naturally flourish and grow, the formal blessings maintain their careful silence about oil. Families might tell the oil story over dinner, children might learn it through songs and games, but when they turned to formal prayer, ancient restraint reasserted itself. The prayers preserved what the earliest traditions remembered before later embellishments took root. Consider the psychological wisdom embedded in these prayers. The rabbis who composed them understood human nature, how stories evolve and change through telling. By keeping formal liturgy focused on historically documented events, military victory, and temple rededication, they created an anchor of authentic tradition. The prayers could accommodate growing folklore without being compromised by it. Like a steady lighthouse beam cutting through fog, the core liturgy preserved what was most certain while allowing celebration to flourish around it. The Talmudic rabbis, who first recorded the oil story, centuries after the Maccabean revolt, were brilliant scholars who knew their limitations. They distinguished between legal precedent and inspirational story, between historical fact and meaningful legend. Perhaps their oil narrative was always meant as midrash interpretive story, designed to teach spiritual lessons rather than record historical events. The prayer's silence suggests this distinction was understood, that liturgy preserved history, while story conveyed meaning, two different but equally valuable traditions. Modern scholarship has noticed this liturgical silence, this gap between prayer and popular belief. Some suggest it reflects ancient Jewish priorities, valuing human effort, blessed by divine favor, over passive reliance on miracles. The prayers celebrate the Maccabees' courage, their willingness to fight impossible odds, their dedication to temple service. Perhaps the earliest traditions emphasized partnership between human and divine, making the later oil stories focus on pure miracle feel somehow incomplete, too removed from the messy reality of faithful struggle. The beauty of these prayers lies partly in their restraint. They avoid grand claims that might later prove embarrassing, focusing instead on themes that resonate across generations: victory over oppression, dedication to spiritual principles, courage in the face of overwhelming odds. These remain relevant, whether or not oil burned for 8 days. The prayer's careful language creates space for both historical skeptic and devoted believer, both scholarly inquiry and faithful celebration, uniting diverse Jewish communities around shared core values. As you drift toward sleep, consider the wisdom of these ancient prayer composers. They created liturgy that could survive the test of time, words that remained meaningful regardless of how historical understanding might evolve. Their prayers celebrate divine involvement in human affairs without making specific claims that archaeology might challenge. In their careful silence about oil miracles, they preserved something more precious than any single story: the enduring relationship between human courage and divine blessing that defines faithful living. The prayers continue in synagogues tonight, just as they have for centuries. Ancient words carrying ancient wisdom, celebrating triumph and dedication without depending on miraculous oil for their power. In this beautiful restraint, in this careful silence, we glimpse the humility of religious traditions that value truth over convenience, authenticity over easy answers. Let these quiet prayers lull you into peaceful rest, knowing that some silences speak more eloquently than words, that absence itself can be a form of sacred testimony. Chapter 8: Illuminating the Comfortable Untruth. Sometimes the stories we treasure most carry within them the very human need for meaning, for divine intervention in our darkest moments. Tonight we explore how narrative itself becomes a sanctuary, how the tale of miraculous oil may have emerged not from ancient flames, but from the tender desire to find God's hand in victory. Let these revelations unfold gently, like pages turning in candlelight, as we examine this possibility with compassionate curiosity. Picture the original witnesses of Hanukkah, the Maccabees themselves, standing in their reclaimed temple. Their own written accounts survive to this day, chronicling every detail of their triumph. Yet something remarkable is missing from these first-hand testimonies, something that would become central to the holiday centuries later. In all their careful documentation of battles won and altars rebuilt, there is complete silence about oil lasting 8 miraculous days. This absence speaks volumes, whispering questions into the flickering darkness. The books of Maccabees, written by those who lived through these very events, describe the temple's rededication with meticulous care. They celebrate the military victory, the purification of sacred space, the joy of worship restored. But nowhere in these contemporary accounts do we find mention of insufficient oil stretching miraculously beyond its natural limits. These texts, preserved in ancient libraries, tell of 8 days of celebration, yet attribute them to rebuilding, not to divine multiplication of sacred flame. Even Josephus, the great Jewish historian who documented every significant event of his people, remains silent about this miracle. His extensive writings explore Hanukkah's origins in detail, describing the temple's liberation, the courage of the Maccabees, the establishment of the festival. Yet this historian, who delighted in recording divine interventions, never mentions oil lasting beyond expectation. This scholarly silence echoes through centuries, creating space where questions can breathe, where truth and myth dance together in shadow. For 600 years, this miraculous oil story simply did not exist in Jewish tradition. Generations celebrated Hanukkah as a festival of military triumph, of religious freedom reclaimed through human courage. The holiday thrived without divine oil, finding meaning in liberation itself. Only in the Babylonian Talmud, composed centuries later, does this tale of miraculous multiplication first appear. 6 centuries of silence, followed by sudden emergence, suggests a story born not of memory, but of need. Imagine the rabbis of Babylon, scholars seeking to reshape their people's understanding of victory. They inherited a holiday celebrating military conquest, bloody and triumphant, but perhaps too worldly for their spiritual vision. In their wisdom, they may have crafted something more palatable, a tale that shifted focus from sword to sanctuary, from human agency to divine intervention. This transformation, if it occurred, speaks to the power of narrative to heal, to comfort, to make meaning from complexity. The original 8 days held their own significance, independent of miraculous oil. Some scholars suggest they commemorated the time needed to craft a new altar, each day marking sacred work completed. Others propose the celebration echoed Sukkot, the harvest festival the Maccabees had missed during their struggle. 8 days of joy, 8 days of gratitude, 8 days of reconnecting with traditions nearly lost. These explanations need no miracles, finding wonder instead in human perseverance and the restoration of sacred rhythm. There is something deeply human about our need to find God in our victories. The Maccabean triumph, impressive as it was, remained stubbornly earthly, achieved through strategy and sacrifice rather than divine intervention. Perhaps this troubled later generations who yearned to see divine fingerprints on their salvation. The oil story, if fabricated, would have served this longing perfectly, transforming a political victory into a spiritual one, making space for the sacred in the secular. Even today, traditional Jewish prayers about Hanukkah focus on military victory and temple rededication. They speak of triumph over oppressors, of religious freedom restored, of the temple purified and rededicated. But these ancient liturgical texts, preserved through generations of worship, make no mention of miraculous oil. This liturgical silence suggests the oil story, however beloved, was never central to Hanukkah's original spiritual significance. The prayers remember what mattered most: liberation and the return to sacred practice. Archaeological silence joins textual absence, creating a chorus of missing evidence. No ancient oil vessels bearing traces of miraculous multiplication, no contemporary inscriptions celebrating supernatural flame, no artifacts suggesting divine intervention in temple lighting. The archaeological record, patient and objective, speaks only of military victory and religious restoration. Sometimes absence tells its own story, whispering truths we might not expect to hear, inviting us to find wonder in what actually happened rather than what we wished had occurred. Consider the psychological comfort of the oil story, how it transforms a tale of violence into one of divine care. The original Hanukkah celebrated armed resistance, necessary but brutal, leaving blood on temple stones before they could be purified. Perhaps later generations needed something gentler, a miracle that spoke of God's provision rather than human warfare. The oil story, if invented, would have served this need beautifully, wrapping harsh necessity in the soft glow of divine intervention. The timing of the oil story's emergence, 6 centuries after the events, coincides with rabbinic efforts to reshape Jewish identity. During the Talmudic period, scholars were crafting new meanings for old traditions, seeking to emphasize divine providence over military might. The oil miracle, appearing precisely when needed, served this theological agenda perfectly. It allowed Hanukkah to remain a festival of liberation while shifting emphasis from human agency to divine grace, from warrior courage to God's mysterious provision. There is no shame in narrative evolution, in stories growing richer over time. The oil tale, whether historical fact or loving fabrication, has brought comfort to countless generations. It teaches that God provides in impossible circumstances, that small amounts can accomplish great things when blessed with divine presence. These lessons have value independent of historical accuracy, speaking to universal human experiences of scarcity, need, and unexpected provision. Sometimes the truth of a story lies not in its facts, but in its ability to heal and inspire. Perhaps the most beautiful truth about Hanukkah, whether oil burned miraculously or not, is its celebration of persistence against impossible odds. The Maccabees faced overwhelming forces, cultural extinction, the loss of everything sacred, yet they chose resistance over resignation, action over despair. Their victory, achieved through courage rather than miracles, speaks to human potential for transformation. This truth needs no supernatural embellishment, finding power instead in ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage when everything seemed lost. The act of storytelling itself becomes a kind of miracle, the way narrative can transform trauma into meaning, defeat into hope, uncertainty into comfort. If the oil story was crafted by later generations, then it represents its own kind of sacred act. The human capacity to create meaning from chaos, to find light in darkness through the power of imagination. Stories, whether factual or fabulated, serve as vessels for truth that transcends mere historical accuracy, carrying wisdom across centuries of flickering flame. As we rest in this gentle uncertainty, let the questions themselves become a kind of meditation. Whether oil burned 8 days through divine intervention, or human celebration lasted 8 days for entirely earthly reasons, the light continues to shine. The menorahs still flicker with meaning, the prayers still rise with gratitude. The holiday still speaks to our deepest needs for freedom, faith, and the courage to resist darkness in all its forms. Sometimes the most comfortable truth is that some mysteries can remain beautifully, peacefully unresolved. Chapter 9: Healing Narratives. The oil miracle didn't just appear in the Talmud by accident. It emerged precisely when Jewish communities needed healing most. After centuries of dispersion, persecution, and questioning, the rabbis understood something profound about human nature. Sometimes the stories we create are more important than the facts we preserve. Sometimes fiction becomes the medicine that helps wounded souls remember hope again. Picture those ancient communities scattered across Babylon, carrying the weight of exile in their hearts. The original Hanukkah story felt too sharp, too political, too reminiscent of the violence that had cost them everything. Military victories felt hollow when your people still wandered homeless. Temple rededication rang empty when that same temple lay in ruins again. They needed something gentler, something divine. The rabbis watched their people's faces during the harsh retelling of Maccabean wars, saw how children flinched at tales of bloodshed, noticed how mothers turned away from stories that echoed their own losses. So slowly, carefully, they began weaving something new into the ancient tale. Not lies, but healing. Not deception, but the kind of truth that mends rather than wounds. They understood that communities need different stories at different times. During the actual revolt, tales of military prowess inspired resistance. But 6 centuries later, scattered and vulnerable, their people needed to remember that God still watched over them, that miracles still happened, that light could emerge from the smallest, most impossible places, even when everything seemed lost. The oil miracle became a whispered lullaby for traumatized hearts. Instead of celebrating human violence, they could celebrate divine intervention. Instead of remembering the clash of swords, they could focus on the gentle glow of sacred flames. Instead of honoring warriors who might remind them of their current helplessness, they could honor oil that burned beyond all natural possibility. This wasn't cynical manipulation, it was compassionate storytelling. The rabbis knew their communities were bleeding from spiritual wounds that battlefield victories couldn't heal. They needed to believe that God still cared, that miracles still happened to ordinary people with simple faith. The oil story offered precisely that comfort, wrapped in the familiar warmth of Hanukkah celebration. Listen to how the story changed the emotional landscape of the holiday. Where once there had been triumphant war cries, now there were peaceful blessings over flickering lights. Where once there had been tales of enemies defeated, now there were gentle meditations on divine providence. The same 8 days transformed from commemoration of violence into celebration of hope. The beauty lies in how naturally this healing narrative took root. Communities embraced the oil miracle, not because they were gullible, but because their hearts recognized exactly what they needed to hear. That God worked through small things, ordinary people, simple acts of faith. That light could outlast darkness, even when all logic suggested otherwise. Children who once cowered during retellings of Maccabean battles now gathered eagerly around menorahs, their eyes bright with wonder instead of fear. Parents found bedtime stories that spoke of miracles rather than warfare, of oil that burned with divine love, rather than cities that burned with human hatred. The holiday became a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. This transformation reveals something beautiful about how communities heal. They don't simply forget trauma, they gradually reshape painful memories into sources of strength. The Maccabean revolt remained in the story, but softened by divine intervention. The temple rededication continued, but illuminated by miraculous light. History became hope through careful, loving retelling. The rabbis understood that healing happens in layers, like oil spreading slowly across water. First, you acknowledge the wound, then you begin building something beautiful around it. The oil miracle didn't erase the violence of the original story. It simply offered a different way to remember, a gentler way to celebrate, a more peaceful way forward. Consider how this healing narrative changed prayer itself. Instead of thanking God for military victories, communities began blessing the miracle of light. Instead of remembering enemies defeated, they celebrated divine providence. The same historical events, but viewed through the lens of divine love rather than human conflict. The prayers themselves became acts of healing. The oil miracle taught scattered communities that God worked in intimate, personal ways, not just in grand military victories that belonged to the distant past, but in small, everyday miracles that could happen anywhere, anytime. A single day's worth of oil lasting 8 days felt possible, accessible, like something that might happen to any faithful family. This shift from celebrating human heroism to divine intervention served another healing purpose. It removed the burden of having to be warriors. Scattered communities couldn't fight like the Maccabees, but they could maintain faith like the temple priests. They couldn't win military victories, but they could witness everyday miracles. The story became something they could live rather than just remember. The gentle rhythm of lighting one candle each night created a healing ritual that communities could practice together. 8 nights of gradually increasing light, like hope slowly returning to wounded hearts. Each flame a reminder that darkness doesn't last forever, that even the smallest light can push back enormous shadows, that miracles hide in the most ordinary moments. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, consider this beautiful truth about healing narratives. Sometimes the stories that help us most aren't the ones that happened exactly as written, but the ones that happen exactly as needed. Sometimes fiction becomes the truest thing we know, not because it matches history, but because it matches hope. Sweet Dreams, Chapter 10, Lessons from the Lampstand. As we near the end of our journey through Hanukkah's hidden history, the menorah's flames flicker with deeper wisdom. 8 nights of light, 8 lessons waiting to be discovered. The Maccabees fought not just for freedom, but for the right to tell their own story. Yet somehow, their actual story got buried beneath layers of later meaning. Tonight, let these gentle flames illuminate what we can learn from both the facts and the beautiful myths that followed. The first lesson whispers from the lampstand. Sometimes the most powerful truths aren't miraculous at all. The Maccabees didn't need divine oil to validate their struggle. Their courage alone lit the temple. Their determination alone rekindled hope. When we strip away the supernatural elements, we don't diminish their story. We reveal something even more remarkable. Ordinary people choosing extraordinary bravery. Human hands building something sacred. Real dedication burning brighter than any mythical flame could ever shine. The second lesson flickers softly. Historical truth doesn't always comfort us the way we need. The rabbis who added the oil miracle centuries later weren't trying to deceive anyone. They were trying to heal. Violence and warfare leave scars on collective memory. Sometimes communities need gentler stories to process trauma. The oil tale transformed a bloody revolution into a story of divine care. It gave people permission to celebrate victory without glorifying violence. The third lesson glows steadily. Stories evolve because people need them to evolve. The Maccabees needed a story of military triumph. Later generations needed a story of spiritual miracle. Both versions carried truth, just different kinds of truth. The warrior's truth of physical struggle, the mystic's truth of meaning and purpose. Neither story is wrong, they simply serve different communities in different times. each providing exactly the light that was needed. The fourth lesson burns quietly. Silence in historical records doesn't always mean absence. It might mean the miracle was so ordinary it didn't seem worth recording. Oil lasting 8 days, perhaps it wasn't viewed as supernatural by those who lived it. Maybe they had practical explanations. Maybe small amounts of oil really did stretch further than expected through careful rationing. Sometimes the miracle is in human ingenuity and resourcefulness rather than divine intervention. The fifth lesson dances gently. The gap between event and story tells its own tale. 600 years passed before the oil miracle appeared in written form. That's enough time for oral tradition to transform practical solutions into supernatural events. Memory softens hard edges. Time adds meaning where there was once just survival. The Babylonian Talmud's rabbis weren't fabricating, they were preserving what their community had come to understand as the deeper truth of those 8 nights. The sixth lesson illuminates softly. Even prayers reveal the layers of meaning. Traditional Hanukkah prayers still focus on military victory and temple dedication. They barely mention the oil. This suggests the miracle was never the central point for earlier generations. The prayers remember the Maccabees as warriors and the temple as a place reclaimed through human effort. The oil story became beloved folklore, but the prayers preserve the original emphasis on courage, determination, and sacred space. The seventh lesson sparkles peacefully. Multiple truths can coexist without canceling each other out. The historical Hanukkah celebrates human triumph over oppression. The mystical Hanukkah celebrates divine presence in dark times. The family Hanukkah celebrates light, togetherness, and hope. Each tradition holds its own validity. Each serves its own purpose. The menorah's 8 flames remind us that light comes in many forms, and all of them are real, all of them are necessary, all of them are true. The 8th lesson glimmers tenderly. Sometimes the most important question isn't what really happened, but what the story does for us now. Does the oil miracle inspire you to find light in darkness? Then it's true for you. Does the warrior story remind you to stand up for your beliefs? Then it's true for you. Truth isn't always factual. Sometimes truth is functional. Stories work when they help us become better versions of ourselves, when they give us courage, hope, and meaning. As these lessons settle into your sleepy consciousness, notice how the menorah holds space for all these truths simultaneously. 8 branches reaching in different directions, yet connected to the same source. The historical truth, the spiritual truth, the family truth, the personal truth, each flame distinct, yet part of the same light. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of all, that truth itself is not singular, but multifaceted, not simple, but beautifully complex. The Maccabees' real miracle wasn't supernatural oil, it was their refusal to let their culture disappear. They fought not just against armies, but against assimilation, not just for territory, but for the right to remain themselves. In our modern world, we face different pressures to conform, to blend in, to let our unique traditions fade away. Their example whispers across the centuries, hold fast to what makes you who you are. Some things are worth fighting for, and perhaps there's wisdom too in how the story grew. Communities need myths that match their circumstances. The warrior tale served people facing immediate threats. The miracle tale served people seeking comfort and meaning. Neither generation was wrong to tell the story their way. As you drift toward sleep, consider what version of your own story you need right now. What meaning do you need to extract from your experiences? What light do you need to kindle? The lampstand teaches us about the patient accumulation of meaning over time. Stories aren't static, they breathe, they grow, they adapt to new circumstances while keeping their essential heart intact. The heart of Hanukkah, whether we emphasize war or miracle, remains the triumph of light over darkness, hope over despair, the few over the many. These themes speak to every generation because they address the eternal human condition, our constant struggle to find meaning in chaos. As sleep begins to claim you, let the menorah's flames remind you that every tradition is a conversation between past and present. The ancient Maccabees speak to us through their actions. The medieval rabbis speak to us through their interpretations. Modern families speak to us through their celebrations. And you add your own voice to this ancient conversation simply by listening, by wondering, by letting these stories become part of your own inner landscape. The lessons from the lampstand settle gently into your sleepy mind. Historical truth and meaningful myth need not be enemies. Human courage and divine presence can dance together in the same story. Facts and faith can share the same flame. As you sink deeper into rest, carry with you this gentle wisdom that truth comes in many forms, that stories serve many purposes, and that light, in all its manifestations, always finds a way to shine through the darkness. Let the final lesson whisper you toward dreams. The real miracle of Hanukkah isn't in supernatural oil or military victory alone. It's in the human capacity to find meaning, to create beauty, to pass stories from generation to generation, to light candles against the darkness year after year. This continuity, this persistence of hope and celebration despite history's challenges, this is the true light that never goes out. Sleep well, cradled by the wisdom of ages past and the promise of light eternal. Chapter 11, Quiet Echoes of Truth. Now we pause and listen to the whispers of history. In the gentle shadows of evening, we hear them, the soft echoes bouncing off temple stones. The truth isn't always what we first believed, but it's beautiful in its own way. Tonight, we gather these scattered pieces of the past, these fragments of memory and meaning, and hold them close like ancient treasures discovered in the quiet. The night watchman walks his rounds, footsteps soft on weathered stone. He carries no torch, just the gentle glow of understanding. Each step echoes with the voices of those who came before, the Maccabees who fought for freedom, the rabbis who shaped meaning from memory. Listen carefully, you can almost hear them whispering their stories into the darkness, stories that grew and changed like shadows dancing on temple walls. The menorah flickers quietly, its light neither magical nor ordinary, but something in between. 9 flames casting 9 different shadows, each one telling part of the story. The shamash stands tall, the helper candle, reminding us that sometimes the most important truths come from those who serve others. Watch how the light dances, never still, never the same twice, just like the stories we tell ourselves about the past. Ancient scriptures rest open in the library, pages yellowed with age and wisdom. The books of Maccabees speak in their own quiet voice, telling of courage and victory, without mention of miraculous oil. These pages don't lie, they simply remember what they remember, and in their silence about oil, they echo with the truth of human bravery, the kind that doesn't need miracles to be meaningful and profound. Josephus sits at his writing desk, quill poised over parchment. He records everything he knows about the temple, the battles, the celebration of freedom, but his pages too are silent about oil lasting 8 days. Not because he forgot, not because he didn't care, but perhaps because the miracle hadn't been born yet in the collective memory of his people. Truth has its own timeline, its own patient rhythm. 600 years pass like a gentle wind, carrying stories from mouth to ear, from generation to generation. And then, in Babylon, in the halls where rabbis debate and discuss, a new story emerges. The oil that lasted 8 days, born not from deception, but from a deep human need to find God in the everyday, to transform memory into meaning, to make the ordinary sacred through retelling. The Babylonian Talmud opens its pages, and there, finally, the miracle appears in writing. Not as historical fact, but as sacred story. The rabbis understood something beautiful, that truth comes in many forms. Sometimes truth is what happened, sometimes truth is what needs to happen in our hearts. They gave their people a different kind of victory, a spiritual one, wrapped in golden oil and divine light. Perhaps they remembered Sukkot, the 8-day festival they couldn't celebrate during the war. Perhaps the 8 days echoed that missed celebration, a way of saying we survived, we endured, we can finally feast again. Or maybe it was the 8 days needed to build a new altar, to sanctify the space, to make it holy once more. Time has a way of weaving meaning from the simplest of threads. The scholars gather around their texts, not to destroy faith, but to understand it more deeply. They trace the evolution of story, how human memory shapes itself, how communities create meaning from shared experience. There's no betrayal here, no loss of sacred truth, just the beautiful recognition that stories grow and change, like living things, adapting to the needs of each generation that tells them. The prayers still echo in synagogues, thanking God for delivering the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few. Notice what they remember: victory, dedication, deliverance. The oil remains quietly absent from these ancient words, but their absence doesn't diminish the gratitude, doesn't lessen the joy, doesn't make the celebration any less meaningful or true. War stories are hard to tell children, hard to make sense of, hard to transform into bedtime tales. But oil is gentle, oil is light, oil is warmth against the darkness. Perhaps the rabbis understood that every generation needs its own way of receiving truth, its own gentle path to understanding, its own bridge between the harsh realities of history and the tender hopes of faith. The temple chambers breathe quietly, filled with the presence of all who have walked these halls. Warriors and priests, scholars and storytellers, each adding their voice to the echo. The oil vessels sit empty now, but they're beautiful in their emptiness. Reminders that sometimes absence teaches us as much as presence, that silence can be its own kind of sacred song. Truth doesn't always mean what literally happened. Sometimes truth means what needed to happen in the human heart. The Maccabees gave their people political freedom, but the oil story gave them spiritual comfort, divine connection, the assurance that God was present even in the darkest times. Both truths matter, both serve, both deserve their place in the echoing halls of memory. We've walked together through these ancient halls, turned over these time-worn stones, listened to these patient echoes. What have we found? Not deception, but the beautiful complexity of how humans create meaning, how communities shape story, how truth wears many faces, all of them reflecting something real and precious about the human need to find light, to celebrate survival, to remember hope. The night grows deeper, and the echoes grow softer, but they never quite fade away. In every candle lit, in every story told, in every moment of gratitude for small miracles, the truth continues. Not the truth of what must have happened, but the truth of what happens when human hearts reach toward light, toward meaning, toward the sacred possibility that maybe, just maybe, ordinary moments can become extraordinary. Rest now in the quiet echoes. Let them carry you toward peaceful dreams. The mystery isn't solved, it's transformed. From questions into wonder, from doubt into deeper understanding, from simple answers into the beautiful complexity of human faith. Sleep well, knowing that truth, like light, comes in many forms, and all of them in their own way illuminate something precious about the journey we share. Chapter 12, Embers of Reality. Here we stand at the threshold of understanding, where shadows meet light and truth emerges from centuries of silence. The menorah glows softly before us, its flames dancing against the walls of time. We've traveled far together through layers of history, peeling back stories that seemed so certain, so absolute. Now we must embrace what we've discovered, not with fear or disappointment, but with the quiet courage of those who seek truth above comfort. The hard edges of real history don't diminish the beauty of faith. They simply reveal it in a different light. Like archaeologists brushing dust from ancient pottery, we uncover fragments that tell their own stories, stories perhaps more human, more vulnerable, more real than the myths we've cherished. In this gentle evening glow, we learn that truth doesn't destroy wonder, it transforms it into something deeper, something that honors both human struggle and divine possibility. The Maccabees fought real battles with real consequences, their victory carved from flesh and determination rather than miraculous intervention. Yet this doesn't make their story less sacred, perhaps more so. They faced impossible odds with nothing but courage. They reclaimed their temple through sacrifice and strategy. They lit those first flames, not because oil lasted 8 days, but because hope itself refused to be extinguished, even in the darkest of times. 600 years of silence speaks its own truth, like empty spaces in ancient manuscripts where certain words were never written. The earliest celebrations honored military triumph, temple rededication, the raw human achievement of freedom won through struggle. There was beauty in this simplicity, in recognizing that sometimes people must fight for what they believe, that sometimes the divine works through human hands, through human hearts, that refuse to surrender. Josephus knew the stories, chronicled the wars, recorded the victories, yet never mentioned oil lasting beyond its natural limit. His silence echoes through history like an empty temple chamber, not because he forgot, not because he didn't care, but because the miracle hadn't yet been born in the minds of later storytellers. Truth has its own timeline, its own patient rhythm, waiting centuries sometimes before revealing what really happened. The rabbis in Babylon faced their own darkness, their own need to find meaning in exile, in separation from the temple, from the land of their ancestors. Perhaps they looked at the Maccabee story and felt the weight of its violence, the uncomfortable reality that salvation sometimes comes through sword and strategy rather than divine intervention. In their yearning for God's presence, they crafted a different kind of truth, one that honored longing over history. The 8 days may have echoed Sukkot, the festival they'd missed while hiding in mountains, fighting for their lives. Or perhaps it marked the time needed to build a new altar, to craft new vessels, to restore what had been desecrated. These practical explanations don't diminish the sacred. They ground it in human experience, in the patient work of rebuilding, of starting over, of creating beauty from destruction. Even today, traditional prayers about Hanukkah speak of military victory, of enemies defeated, of the temple restored but remains silent about miraculous oil. This ancient liturgy preserves the original memory, the first understanding of what Hanukkah meant to those who lived it. The prayers honor the Maccabees as warriors, as liberators, as men who fought not because God promised victory, but because freedom was worth the risk of everything. There's profound beauty in embracing this reality, in recognizing that human courage can be its own kind of miracle. The Maccabees didn't wait for divine intervention, they became the intervention themselves. They didn't pray for oil to last, they made sure the flame would endure through their own dedication, their own sacrifice, their own refusal to let darkness win. This is perhaps the deeper miracle, the one written in flesh rather than legend. The psychological need to add God back into the story speaks to something profound in human nature, our desire to see the divine hand in moments of triumph, our longing to believe that justice comes from above rather than from our own difficult choices. The rabbis who crafted the oil story weren't lying, they were reaching for something transcendent, something that would help their people remember that victory belongs not just to the strong, but to the faithful. Yet there's something deeply moving about the original story, stripped of miracle, reduced to its human essence. A small group of people decided their freedom mattered more than their safety, their faith mattered more than their lives. They fought with whatever they could find. They won through strategy and sacrifice. They restored their temple, not because God commanded it, but because they couldn't bear to live without it. The centuries between event and miracle tell their own story of how memory transforms, how meaning deepens, how truth can wear many faces without losing its essential power. The Babylonian rabbis weren't falsifying history, they were creating meaning from history, finding ways to help their people connect with the divine, even in exile, even in darkness, even when the original temple lay in ruins again. Perhaps the real miracle isn't oil lasting 8 days, but the fact that this story survived at all, that the memory of resistance lived through centuries of persecution, that the flame of freedom kept burning in human hearts long after the original menorah was destroyed. The Maccabees lit a fire that couldn't be extinguished, not because of supernatural intervention, but because some truths are too important to forget. As we embrace these hard edges of history, we don't diminish Hanukkah, we honor it more deeply. We recognize that real people made real choices, that freedom comes at real cost, that sometimes the most sacred acts are the most human ones. The menorah's light doesn't need a miracle to be meaningful. It needs only the courage to kindle flame in darkness, to choose hope over despair, to keep lighting candles even when oil runs low. The rich fabric of human resolve and creativity reveals itself in layers, in the original courage of the Maccabees, in the literary creativity of the rabbis, in the enduring power of a story that means different things to different generations. Truth isn't singular, it's woven from multiple threads, historical fact and spiritual meaning, military victory and religious inspiration, human struggle and divine possibility, all dancing together in the flame. Tonight, as shadows deepen around us, as the menorah's soft, warm glow settles into our hearts, we rest in this understanding that truth doesn't destroy wonder, it transforms it. The embers of reality glow quietly, not with disappointment, but with deeper appreciation for the complexity of faith, the courage of questioning, the beauty of embracing what is rather than what we wish were true. Sleep well, knowing that truth itself is sacred. Chapter 13, The Power of Perseverance. In the gentle glow of menorahs tonight, we discover something profound about the human spirit, how determination flows through generations like an unbroken flame, the Maccabees who reclaimed their temple, modern families lighting candles in apartment windows. They're connected by something deeper than tradition. It's perseverance itself, the quiet courage to continue when everything seems lost, to rebuild what was broken, to keep sacred fires burning through the darkest nights of history. Picture the temple courts after the Maccabean victory, not the miracle we've heard about, but something more human and perhaps more beautiful. Exhausted warriors surveying their reclaimed sanctuary, seeing the work ahead, the massive task of purification and restoration. They could have waited, could have made excuses, could have delayed until conditions were perfect. Instead, they began immediately with whatever oil they had, however little time remained, trusting that their effort mattered more than perfect circumstances. This is where perseverance lives, not in miraculous extensions of supply, but in the decision to begin with what you have. The Maccabees didn't wait for enough oil to last forever. They lit what they could, trusted the process, believed that dedication itself creates its own sustaining power. 8 days of rededication, 8 days of choosing hope over despair, 8 days of proving that human commitment can feel miraculous even without divine intervention, especially without it. Centuries later, rabbis would add mystery to this moment, would speak of oil lasting impossibly long. But perhaps they sense something true, that when people commit fully to rebuilding what matters, time itself seems to expand. Work flows more smoothly, solutions appear more readily, communities rally in unexpected ways. Not because of magic, but because perseverance creates its own momentum, its own expansion of possibility, its own kind of daily miracle, born from human determination and shared purpose. Fast forward through history to families fleeing persecution, carrying only memories of holiday traditions. No temple, no priests, no ancient ceremonies intact. Just the decision to continue anyway, to adapt without abandoning, to persevere through displacement. They lit candles in hidden rooms, taught children songs in whispered voices, maintained connection to something larger than their immediate circumstances. Each small act of continuation, each whispered blessing, each homemade latke, an act of perseverance disguised as tradition. Think about modern Jewish families today, navigating assimilation pressures, maintaining identity while participating fully in broader society. The same spirit that drove temple rededication, now choosing Hebrew school over other activities, keeping kosher in non-kosher worlds, lighting menorahs in December neighborhoods filled with Christmas lights, not because it's easy, not because it's convenient, but because some things matter enough to preserve, to adapt, to continue, even when the original reasons feel distant or unclear. Perseverance isn't dramatic, it's quiet daily choices, the accumulation of small commitments over time. A grandmother teaching grandchildren blessings they might never use, parents explaining customs they themselves question, communities gathering to celebrate holidays that feel increasingly complicated, each generation asking, is this still meaningful? Is this still worth preserving? And somehow, generation after generation, choosing yes, choosing continuation, choosing the beautiful burden of carrying forward what was given to them by those who came before. The menorahs in our story cast light differently now, not illuminating miraculous oil, but revealing something more complex and beautiful. The faces of people choosing tradition despite doubt, choosing community despite differences, choosing celebration despite imperfection. The light reveals mixed families creating new traditions, interfaith couples navigating multiple calendars, children who speak English better than Hebrew, still reaching for candles, still finding meaning in ancient rhythms, still choosing connection over isolation, presence over absence. Perhaps this is what the rabbis sensed when they added mystery to the Maccabean story, that there's something miraculous about cultural survival itself. Not oil lasting 8 days, but traditions lasting thousands of years, customs surviving exile, languages preserved through persecution, recipes passed down through displacement. The real miracle isn't supernatural intervention, it's human determination, the quiet persistence of people who refuse to let meaningful things disappear, who choose continuation over convenience, memory over forgetting. Look closely at any Hanukkah celebration tonight, beyond the prayers and presents, beyond the food and festivities, and you'll see perseverance in action. Parents explaining history, they're still learning themselves. Children participating in customs, older than their understanding. Communities gathering, despite busy schedules and competing obligations. Each gathering, each lighting, each blessing, a small act of defiance against the entropy that naturally pulls communities apart, pulls traditions into obsolescence, pulls memory into forgetfulness. The Maccabees faced armies. Modern families face different challenges: assimilation pressure, cultural drift, the simple passage of time that makes everything feel less urgent, less necessary. But the response is similar: showing up anyway, lighting candles anyway, teaching children anyway, maintaining connection anyway. Not because someone is forcing them, not because the benefits are obvious, but because some things are worth preserving simply because they connect us to history, to community, to something larger than individual convenience. In apartment windows across the world tonight, menorahs burn with this same spirit, electric candles in some homes, real flames in others, each light representing the same choice the Maccabees made centuries ago. The choice to begin with what you have, to continue what you've inherited, to trust that participation itself creates meaning, that showing up consistently over time builds something valuable, something worth passing on, something that connects individual lives to the larger human story of persistence and renewal. The temple, the Maccabees rededicated, is long gone, but the spirit of rededication continues in every family that chooses tradition over convenience, every community that gathers despite differences, every generation that receives inherited customs and somehow, miraculously, passes them forward. Not unchanged, not without adaptation, but continuous nonetheless, like light passed from candle to candle, each flame distinct but connected, each lighting both ending something and beginning something, both memory and renewal, both preservation and transformation. As candlelight flickers across celebration tables tonight, we see perseverance in its most beautiful form, not dramatic heroism, not supernatural intervention, but ordinary people making extraordinary commitments to continuation, choosing presence over absence, choosing gathering over isolation, choosing tradition over convenience. The light reveals faces of all ages, various levels of belief and doubt, different degrees of knowledge and commitment, but united in this simple act, showing up, lighting candles, choosing connection, choosing to continue what was started long ago. The real miracle isn't oil that lasted 8 days. It's communities that last generations. It's customs that survive displacement. It's families that maintain connection across continents and centuries. It's the quiet persistence of people who receive traditions they don't fully understand, adapt them to circumstances the original practitioners never imagined, and somehow pass them forward, still recognizable, still meaningful, still connecting individuals to something larger, still lighting candles against darkness, still choosing hope over despair, presence over absence. And so tonight, as menorahs cast their gentle light across celebration tables and window sills, we rest in this beautiful truth that perseverance itself is miraculous, that showing up consistently creates its own kind of magic, that choosing continuation over convenience, tradition over convenience, connection over isolation, these choices accumulate into something precious, something worth preserving, something worth celebrating. The power of perseverance, burning bright, generation after generation, flame after flame, choice after choice, continuing, enduring, persevering. Chapter 14. In the Stillness of Shadows. Here in the temple's quietest chambers, where ancient stones hold their secrets close, we pause to contemplate what we've discovered. The silence itself speaks volumes, 6 centuries of silence, where a miracle should have echoed. In these shadowy alcoves, empty oil vessels wait patiently, as if holding space for a story not yet born. The lamplight flickers gently, casting questions rather than answers across weathered manuscript pages. Listen to the whisper of turning pages, the books of Maccabees, written while blood still stained the temple floors. Here, chroniclers recorded every detail of victory, every moment of triumph, every stone restored to sacred purpose. Yet nowhere in these first-hand accounts do we find mention of oil burning beyond its natural limits. The authors who lived these events chose instead to celebrate human courage and divine support through victory. Josephus, the great Jewish historian, documented the temple's rededication with meticulous care. He recorded the 8 days of celebration, the joy of restoration, the festival's establishment as annual tradition. But the oil, the miraculous oil that supposedly burned for 8 days, receives not a single word. This master chronicler, passionate about Jewish miracles and divine intervention, somehow overlooked what would become Judaism's most beloved supernatural story. The silence is profound and telling. In libraries across the ancient world, scholars preserved every whisper of the divine. Philo documented miracles in Alexandria. Early rabbis recorded wonders in Jerusalem. Greek historians noted Jewish festivals with careful attention. Yet for 6 centuries after the Maccabean victory, no voice speaks of oil lasting 8 days. The absence creates its own mysterious presence, a gap in the historical record, as significant as any miracle story could be. Picture those early Hanukkah celebrations, veterans of the Maccabean Wars gathering with their families. They kindled lights in remembrance of the temple's restoration, told stories of Judah's courage, celebrated freedom from foreign oppression. Their children asked about the 8 days, and the answers came not in terms of miraculous oil, but of sacred timing. 8 days to build a new altar. 8 days echoing Sukkot they'd missed while fighting. The Sukkot connection whispers its own truth through the centuries. That autumn festival, missed during the war, traditionally lasted 8 days. When the temple was finally free, the celebration naturally echoed those lost holy days. Some scholars suggest the 8-day pattern emerged not from burning oil, but from completing the Sukkot observance they'd been forced to abandon. It's a beautifully human explanation, making up for lost sacred time through extended joy. Then, around 500 CE, something remarkable happened. In the discussions recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, rabbis asked a simple question: My Hanukkah, what is Hanukkah? And suddenly, for the first time in 6 centuries, an answer emerged about oil lasting 8 days. Not from historical memory, not from ancient documents, but from rabbinic discussion. The miracle story appeared fully formed, as if emerging from collective spiritual need rather than historical fact. Imagine those Talmudic scholars gathered in candlelit study halls, wrestling with their ancestors' legacy. The original Hanukkah story troubled them. Too much violence, too much human ambition, too little divine presence. A military victory felt incomplete without God's clear intervention. So, in their discussions, they began to weave something more spiritually satisfying, a miracle that transformed warrior celebration into divine wonder. The oil story became their gift to future generations. The psychological need makes perfect sense when we consider the context. These later rabbis lived under foreign rule, unable to celebrate military victories without political consequences. A miracle about oil was safer than stories of successful rebellion. It shifted focus from dangerous themes of armed resistance to comfortable narratives of divine provision. The lamp oil story let Jewish communities celebrate their ancestors' courage while avoiding contemporary political complications. Brilliant spiritual adaptation. Notice how the miracle story perfectly serves rabbinic theology. Oil represents the divine presence, light symbolizes Torah wisdom, 8 days suggests completion beyond natural cycles. Every element carries deeper meaning. Each detail teaches spiritual lessons. This doesn't diminish the story's power. It reveals the sophisticated theological thinking that created it. The rabbis weren't falsifying history. They were crafting meaning, transforming raw historical events into vessels for eternal truth. Archaeological evidence whispers its own questions. Temple excavations reveal oil production facilities, storage areas for sacred supplies, channels for maintaining the menorah's flame, but nothing suggests the kind of oil shortage that would make 8 days miraculous. The temple complex was designed for continuous operation. Oil supplies were carefully managed, not left to chance. The physical reality suggests abundance, not the scarcity required for miracle. Yet another gentle contradiction. Even today's Jewish liturgy carries traces of this historical evolution. The traditional prayers for Hanukkah focus on military victory, religious freedom, and temple rededication. They mention the miracle of triumph over oppression, the wonder of spiritual restoration, but oil burning for 8 days receives surprisingly little emphasis. The ancient prayers remember the original story, warrior victory, not miraculous combustion. It's as if the earliest liturgical memory preserved the pre-oil narrative. This doesn't make Hanukkah less meaningful. Perhaps it makes it more so. The story reveals how communities transform their memories, how spiritual need shapes historical narrative, how love creates legends. The Maccabees gave their descendants the raw materials of courage and faith. Later generations refined those materials into something more spiritually nourishing, a miracle story that serves the heart, even if it puzzles the historian. Both versions carry profound truth. Consider the beauty of this evolution, a violent story becoming a gentle one, a tale of human triumph expanding to include divine presence, a narrative growing more spiritually rich through centuries of telling. The oil story didn't replace the original, it completed it, adding layers of meaning that spoke to later generations' deepest needs. This is how living traditions work. They grow, adapt, deepen, always serving the community's spiritual hunger. In the temple's restored chambers, both stories coexist peacefully. The Maccabees' military courage and the rabbis' miraculous oil each carry their own truth. their own power to inspire. History tells us what happened. Tradition tells us what it means. The silence of 6 centuries doesn't diminish either narrative. It simply reminds us that meaning often emerges long after events, shaped by the communities who need it most. As shadows deepen in these ancient halls, we rest in appreciation for the human heart that transforms history into hope. Whether we find truth in the Maccabees' swords or the rabbis' oil, Hanukkah remains a festival of light, overcoming darkness, freedom conquering oppression, faith illuminating uncertainty. The miracle lives not in historical verification, but in its power to kindle hope in every generation, including ours. Sleep well, knowing light endures. Chapter 15, Final Glow, Beyond the Miracle. As our journey through ancient corridors draws to a close, the soft glow of understanding illuminates what we've discovered. The menorah's flames flicker gently in the darkness, casting long shadows across centuries of storytelling. We've walked through temple ruins and dusty archives, uncovering layers of history that whisper secrets the ages tried to keep. Now, in this peaceful moment, we pause to reflect on the beautiful complexity of how stories evolve. The silence of those early manuscripts speaks volumes, doesn't it? 600 years of quiet, where victory celebrations echoed through Jerusalem's streets without mention of miraculous oil. The books of Maccabees, written while blood still stained the temple stones, told of military triumph and religious dedication. Yet nowhere in their pages do we find the gentle miracle that would later warm countless hearts on winter nights across the world. Josephus, that meticulous historian who chronicled every detail of Jewish life, walked past this story without a glance. Philo of Alexandria, who found divine meaning in the smallest rituals, remained silent about oil that burned beyond nature's laws. The early rabbis who established Hanukkah as a celebration of freedom and faith, they too focused on victory, not on vessels that refused to empty despite the passage of days. But then, centuries later, something beautiful happened in the study halls of Babylon. Rabbis gathered in lamplight, discussing the meaning of 8 days, searching for divine presence in human triumph. They asked themselves, why 8 days? Why not 7 or 9? And in that questioning, in that deep desire to find God's hand in history, a new story began to take shape in the Talmudic discussions. Perhaps they remembered the 8 days of Sukkot that couldn't be celebrated during the siege. Maybe they thought of the 8 days needed to build a new altar to purify what had been defiled. Or perhaps, in their wisdom, they understood that people needed more than military victory to sustain their faith through exile and persecution. They needed miracle, they needed divine intervention, they needed hope. The oil story isn't deception, it's transformation. It's the ancient art of making meaning from memory, of finding light in the darkness of uncertain times. Those Babylonian rabbis weren't falsifying history, they were answering their community's deepest needs. They took a story of human courage and added divine mystery, creating something that could comfort children through the long winter nights of exile. Think about it. Which story serves the soul better? Warriors reclaiming their temple through blood and determination, or a small cruse of oil that burned with impossible endurance? Which tale would you whisper to a frightened child, or an adult facing their own impossible odds? The rabbis chose the version that spoke to hope rather than conquest, to faith rather than force. Even today, the traditional prayers for Hanukkah remain beautifully silent about the oil. They speak of victory, of purification, of the few overcoming the many. The liturgy remembers the original celebration, while the folklore has grown around it like ivy on ancient stones. Both versions exist in harmony, serving different purposes for different moments in the Jewish journey through time. This doesn't diminish Hanukkah's beauty. It reveals the profound wisdom of how traditions grow and adapt. Stories become more meaningful when they meet the needs of each generation. The Maccabees gave us courage and the will to resist oppression. The rabbis gave us wonder and the assurance that even in our darkest hours, divine light can sustain us beyond all expectation. As you rest tonight, consider this gentle truth that every family story, every cultural tradition, every beloved tale has layers upon layers of meaning. What matters isn't just what happened, but how the telling of what happened has sustained and comforted countless people across generations. The story that serves love and hope is often more valuable than the story that serves only fact. The menorah's flames dance before us now, each light representing not just one night of ancient celebration, but centuries of people finding meaning in ritual, finding community in shared story, finding peace in the gentle mysteries that connect us to something larger than ourselves. Whether oil burned for 8 days or not, the light of understanding burns eternal in seeking minds. In the soft glow of historical inquiry, we've learned that truth comes in many forms. There's the truth of what happened in that temple long ago, and there's the truth of what communities needed those events to mean. Both truths coexist beautifully, like multiple flames on a single menorah, each contributing its light to our understanding of how humans create meaning from memory. The archaeological silence about oil doesn't silence the wonder. The Talmudic addition doesn't diminish the historical victory. Instead, we have a richer story, one that shows how faith communities take historical events and weave them into tapestries of meaning that can comfort, inspire, and sustain people through the inevitable darkness that visits every human life. This is wisdom, not deception. As our exploration draws to a close, the temple grows quiet around us. The last echoes of ancient celebrations fade into peaceful silence. We've walked with warriors and rabbis, with historians and faithful communities, discovering that the most beautiful truths often exist not in perfect historical accuracy, but in the loving transformation of memory into meaning, of event into eternal comfort. So let the lights of understanding glow softly as you drift toward sleep. Let the whisper of ancient pages turning in distant libraries become your lullaby. The story of Hanukkah, whether in its military origins or miraculous additions, remains a celebration of light, persisting through darkness, of small communities maintaining hope against overwhelming odds, of the human gift for finding the sacred in the everyday. Rest now in the gentle glow of knowledge gained and mysteries embraced. Tomorrow's light will bring new questions, new stories, new opportunities to find meaning in the beautiful complexity of human experience. But tonight, let the eternal flame of curiosity burn softly as you journey into dreams, carrying with you the peace that comes from understanding that truth, like light, has many sources and many forms.